Well, good afternoon and welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian Van Vactor and I'm happy to be in studio live streaming from Tucson, Arizona, Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, with one of our pastors, Sean Richards, otherwise known as That Guy.
Not this guy, that guy.
That guy. For those of you who tune in daily, you'll know what that means. And today is, it's Monday, and that means it's Apologetics Monday, where we cover a specific topic. Typically, we take questions off the cuff from our audience pertaining to the Christian life, the Christian worldview, how to apply Scripture to your life, how to interpret the Bible, or if you're a skeptic and you want good reasons for believing what the historic Christian faith teaches and believes and what's based on, and all sorts of questions that people have tuned in to ask here on the program. So this is a weekday Bible answer program. Again, off the cuff, live, and we do it every Monday through Friday, 4 to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So we're here for you. We have a wonderful panel of pastors who have spent their entire lives getting degrees, learning the languages, getting into the historical and grammatical text or context, I guess you could say, so that we could, as the Bible says, rightfully handle the word of truth. And that's what it's about, really. It's about discovering and knowing truth. It's not about finding a mental crutch. It's not about how I was raised or any kind of prejudicial bias. In fact, whenever I have conversations with people, I wasn't raised in a Christian home, I always ask three simple questions, or I should say I give people three simple options. Is what we believe based on emotional reasons, prejudicial reasons, or intellectual reasons? And I always say, well, the first two really doesn't give us a criteria for arriving at truth. However, the latter, that's the main thing. And how do we know truth? Well, we've talked about that before in the program. That's empiricism and reason, the five senses, and we use logic and reason and facts and evidence. And so that's what we're about. And today we're going to be covering a very, very great topic, one that I've been hoping that we would cover for a while, and that is gospel authorship. So often, people who, even folks who have come from the faith, will say, oh, we don't know really who wrote the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's what hundreds of years later, church councils decided to put those names on those. And so we're going to cover that today. But before we get to that, for those of you who are new to the program, and you say, well, I want to ask a question. I want to poke at a Christian pastor and find out what it is that they really believe and why. Well, you can do that in multiple ways. Join the live stream, and you can do that on YouTube, Facebook, X platform, and just join the comment section, watch the live stream, ask away. We'll monitor those throughout the program. If we don't get to your question today, we'll save it, get it to the next day, but every question will get answered. Our YouTube channel is A Reason for Hope, so you just search for A Reason, the number 4, Hope. And if you see the little red icon with the white deb, then you know you found the right place. You can go straight to our channel, youtube.com/@a-reason-4 Hope. And you can get to us that way. You can also catch us on Facebook. Our church Facebook page is Calvary Christian Fellowship. Or you can go straight to our page by just putting in facebook.com/CCF Tucson. Get us that way. Our X platform is our senior pastor's, formerly Twitter, profile. So we live stream through that account. It's a very informative and active and entertaining X feed. And so if you want to follow our senior pastor, Scott Richards, on the X platform and not miss any famous and informative, especially when it comes to staying in touch with what's going on with the nation of Israel, Middle East, there's always updates there. So check it out. And that handle, if you want to follow our senior pastor, is twitter.com/ScottR4H. That's Scott, the letter R, the number 4, the letter H. And if you join the live stream on that platform, on an Android device, it's a bit buggy. So if you want to ask a question there, it's probably better to just direct message Pastor Scott. Or you can just tweet out a question and just make sure you tag us, and we'll catch it that way. Also, if you want to avoid social media altogether, you can go to our website. Our website address is calvarychristianfellowship.com. Hit the Watch Live tab. Not only can you watch this program every weekday, you can also catch our Wednesday evening Oasis service, where we are currently going through the book of Hosea. And Sunday mornings, 9 and 11 a.m., we are currently going through the book of Acts. We teach the Bible chapter by chapter, book by book. So it's a great way to really study the Bible. So we have a huge archive at our website of teachings throughout the entire Bible, so I'd encourage you to check it out. And last but not least, if you want to ask a question that's a bit personal, sensitive, you want to just kind of not put it on social media at all, you can do so by emailing us. That's email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. Before we get to our topic for today, we'll take a moment to pray. And again, on Apologetics Mondays, we do encourage you to ask questions as long as they're sort of revolving around the topic today. Today's topic is gospel authorship. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write the Gospels? Do we have any historical evidence for that? And maybe if you have a question pertaining to how the Gospels were transmitted, probably fair game for today's topic. But before we do that, let's take a moment. Sean, would you pray for our time and we'll get going?
Be an honor. Dad, thank you for the honor we have to share your word, to recognize the reasons we have to trust it, and to, by your Spirit, communicate that effectively to others. Enable Adrian and I to do nothing less, to bring a smile to your face, edification, exhortation, and comfort to your people, and to ultimately answer before you, having done our due diligence, not only placing our trust in the right things, but letting that trust be based on reason, as it's the only way to please you, as your word says. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So, Sean, gospel authorship. It's probably the biggest criticism, and it's not a criticism per se on Christianity, but the contents of the Gospels is probably another subject. But I get a lot of ex-Christians, people who have deconstructed or left the faith, say, "Oh, we don't know who wrote these things. These were attributed to those authors hundreds of years after the fact." Is there any evidence one way or the other? Do we just not know? Or why is this even an issue that people raise?
Yeah, and that's always the tricky part. The difference between a question and a doubt is the belief that there is an answer. And if people don't know how to look for answers, or they've been handed a criteria that nothing else in history would survive, they set themselves up for failure when the actual truth may be a lot easier to come to than they think. First of all, understand that the argument that the Gospels were anonymous and that the Christians assigned names to them later has a number of agendas, depending on who's making the accusation. For example, Muslims would make the accusation to undermine their credibility, since the Gospels disagree with the Quran. The Quran says otherwise, but that's another topic. Atheists would make the accusation to undermine their credibility as much as Muslims do, but they also want to make sure it's insisting on that the fact that, as you said, Christianity isn't based on actual history, but what was arbitrarily decided by Christians after the fact. And if that's the actual case, then we should be concerned, because rarely do people come to the actual truth at random, unless, of course, they're talking about the origin of the universe. But even cult groups, people like Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, the works, they would bring this up to present their works as superior, since they are certain where they came from, whereas the Gospels, well, they need to be read through the lens of their new revelation. But the reality is that there's only two obstacles between people in recognizing who the authors of the Gospel are basically the same two obstacles between people and most things: consistency and the actual information available. Consistency meaning that you need to be able to handle the evidence, the standards that you're putting forward, and the combination thereof, the same way you would apply them to anything, and of course knowing what information you actually have. People can have consistent standards but think there's no evidence. People can have the evidence but be handed inconsistent standards. Neither are going to lead you to the truth. So instead of just playing the Bart Ehrman game, and for those of you who aren't familiar, he's a forked-tongued critic of Christianity who likes to wave around his credentials and talk out of both sides of his mouth. When he's among people that know what they're talking about, he'll, of course, give you the same information I'm giving you. But when he's speaking to pop culture, comedy shows, and people who don't generally know much about a topic, he's all too eager to even publish books that many people have called him out on for being outright deceptive in presenting this information when it's not actually going to be the case. We don't want you to take our word for it either, because critics of Christianity, just like us, can, of course, depend on your lack of information, or at least your lack of experience handling history, and end up just leading you down a road that we want you to. But that would be just as manipulative in the opposite direction. If the truth is found in a specific spot, then we want to know where it actually can be found. So in this next hour, we're going to discuss first how history is actually examined, what counts as history, what history is available regarding the authors of the Gospels, and then once all the information is out there, giving us all the opportunity to ask the right kinds of questions when these just so or everyone know conversations come up. So our goal isn't to tell you what to think or what to conclude. The goal is to give you an example of how people trained in this field think through these issues, and giving you the opportunity to use the information we'll provide and that you can double check on in order to see whether or not we can know not only that the Gospels were written by actual authors, but the same authors we attribute to them, and of course the reasons we have to trust these individuals as firsthand witnesses. So starting with the first, what is history? The art of historical criticism isn't to say that everything in history is wrong per se, but it's essentially the rules or the things that historians look for when they're trying to figure out what exactly you're dealing with when it comes to good versus bizarre history. Obviously, in the day and age we live in, where not just the printing press but the photocopier are available, we're spoiled as far as the ability to test information. Although with the advent of AI, I think even video camera footage may need some software to clarify these sort of issues. But as far as the sort of things that historians are looking for, the first and most significant, and I say that as much as a pun as a actual reality, is early testimony or primary sources. Now, primary sources aren't just the sources you like, but it's the sources that come from during or around the time that the events took place, things that were reported firsthand by eyewitnesses. And the reason for this is because the closer you are to the originals, the less opportunity you have to embellish details, especially when the original eyewitnesses are still alive. Now, this doesn't eliminate the possibility of embellishment within their lifetimes, but it definitely diminishes the percentage. And just like the skeptic is going to take that little percentage of possibility that someone could lie and say it's an absolute guarantee, we don't also want to say that if there is a possibility they told the truth, then we absolutely know it's for certain. This is one form of evidence, and they rarely settle for just one. But if we have a primary source, which when it comes to ancient history, meaning things over 1,000 years, we don't have any primary sources except for, of course, Christianity. The majority of the information that we have within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses regarding this is absurdly rare, and we need to take credit for that where it's due. But we also need to recognize that this isn't the only sort of evidence out there. And the reason why historians put this in such high regard isn't just because it's rare, but because, like these sort of issues, examining it alongside other evidence gives us the closer to the real deal that we can. Just like, say, a stamp that gets faded in ink over time, they want the clearest picture possible, and that was when the stamp was originally placed. Likewise, primary sources are something to look for, but not something that we should always expect, because when it comes to things over 1,000 years ago, we rarely have anything that would be considered a primary source. Christianity doesn't just have one, but we have four. But that's another issue. The second form of evidence, the sort of things that historians are going to look for, is what's called multiple attestation, which in plain English is when you have many sources saying the same basic thing. The reason why that's something they look for is because the more people you have saying the same basic details about an event, the more likely it's going to be true. And believe it or not, this is actually more important to historians than even primary sources, and it's the strictest standard when it comes to historical criticism, because it's not just rare, as far as the ancient world is concerned, for you to have multiple sources saying the same basic thing, but it's also sought after that if you have at least two of these, it's considered historically certain. Now, again, that makes skeptics nervous, because when they look at our four gospel accounts, they either dismiss it as propaganda and saying it doesn't count as actual history, or they'll say that the Gospels or even the Bible itself is just one book, where it's a collection of books, and the fourfold gospel doubles the minimum of historical certainty as far as a report on events. So multiple attestation is something that we're looking for. And it's not to say that this one person wrote multiple things. We need separate sources all observing the same thing and writing down the same basic details, what also atheists would call contradictions in the Bible.
Yeah.
So that's a...
And oftentimes the four Gospels are dismissed because they all agree with
on the fundamental details.
Yeah, and that's hugely problematic when you're saying that you need, when you, any other historical writing, if there was multiple sources, and people will say, well, it's all coming from the same Bible. No, the Bible is the collection. It's not like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got together and wrote all four together in the same room at the same time.
No,
these were
quick.
four independent eyewitness testimonies about the events that took place in the life of Jesus, and because they're collected in the same work, people dismiss it saying, oh, it's circular reasoning, using the Bible to prove the Bible.
When they don't know what the Bible is.
and no other piece of ancient literature is approached in that way. Oh, well, Julius Caesar, we cannot take his accounts of his Gallic wars because he's the one that wrote them. That doesn't make any sense. So they're using...
Or he's a Roman, and if Romans wrote about Julius Caesar alongside Julius Caesar's Gallic wars, that's a bias, so you can't trust that. No, that would be ridiculous.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a point. Another form of evidence, we come up with it often in the broadcast, is hostile testimony. If enemies of your cause or claims admit to the same basic details of an event, it's that much more likely to be true, because like we talked about with consistency, if you have enemies of something that was made up, they'd be the first to point out that it was fake, and that would be their best criticism of it. Yet there is, for some reason, grounding in these sort of details. And of course, we can talk about the resurrection or the crucifixion, but we're talking specifically about the authorship of the Gospels. Do we have people who are enemies of Christianity that acknowledge these basic facts? That's what we're looking for. And that's the fourth standard, is explanatory power. It's not enough just to have evidence, but you need to have relevant evidence. On Sunday, I do a game with the junior high and high school called Sean is Wrong, where I'll write a bad atheist or occultic claim on the board, and I'll defend it very, very passionately. And I'll even lie through my teeth quoting them in order to put the evidence out there and teach them to engage in rhetoric and debate. But I'll write down the problems on the board, and then they'll have to ask questions that will lead into addressing those real issues. And what's fun about it is it'll give them the chance not just to get things right, like I really give them an applaud when they hold me to things I've said before, and then say, you still have to deal with this main issue. Don't change the subject. But even when they get things wrong, because at least in my experience, you never have more motivation to get to the heart of an issue than when you misrepresented it. And in this case, it's in a safe environment. But with explanatory power, we were talking about, Jesus never existed. And one of them brought up the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I had to point out to them, that's copies of the Old Testament that existed before Jesus. It's evidence for something, but it has nothing to do with the existence of Jesus or not. So when we're talking about evidence for the New Testament, you don't say Jesus was historically crucified, because that would have no bearing on who wrote down the accounts that were reporting that. You could have 4 anonymous authors that wrote down an original event, but you're not there to prove the event, you're there to prove the authorship. So explanatory power is the ability of your evidence to answer questions that are actually being asked. And you can find, again, as an archaeological example, a random piece of pottery or maybe an arrowhead and say that people live there, but it doesn't have anything to do with the name of the people you're trying to find or the culture that they were. But if, on the other hand, you were to find farming tools, that'd be relevant to the question if they were traveling nomads or agrarian, and then you dig for maybe crop evidence and so forth. But if you're asking about text, which is what we're going to be doing today, finding paper with letters on it doesn't settle the issue. For example, when we talked about the reliability and transmission of the Bible, we referenced John Ryland's fragment, P57, but that just includes a section of John 18. That doesn't include a title page. That doesn't tell us who wrote it.
Right.
So that wouldn't be evidence relevant to this conversation. We're looking for verses, quotations, or mentions that the text was not just during that time period, but also specifically relevant to what we're still calling it today. So this is what leads us into the topic of the actual data. What are we going to be looking for as far as textual evidence is concerned? Well, the first and most easiest is to look for the title pages themselves. Do we have manuscripts or copies of the gospel themselves that include these writings in a consistent pattern that we can examine as consistently as we would anything else in history? Another would be contemporary writings of Christians or not, that mention the Gospels and the authors who penned them. You can say that they're biased, but the last time I checked, believing what you're saying doesn't mean that you're wrong, as you said. And that's the whole issue. We need any evidence that we can, and the closer to it, the better. The third would be to understand the historical context in recognizing what we know about the people, places, and events happening when these were written. So, for example, if they were in a culture that wrote down title pages, that would give us reason to look for title pages. But if they were in a culture that wrote things down on scrolls, they didn't write the title pages. They identified who it was from based on the seal that secured it. So we wouldn't be looking for paper, we'd be looking for wax. Another thing that we'd have to ask is, again, if there's not a lot of copies, were they in a culture that publicly accepted them, or were they a persecuted minority that didn't have healthy reasons to make their faith public, at least not in terms of their physical well-being? That would give us fewer copies to expect than many. And if they were impoverished, also not a lot of access to vellum or papyrus, those kinds of issues. What culture, again, like I mentioned, vellum meaning animal skins, papyrus meaning sea reeds and plants. What kind of paper were they writing on? So what should we look for, and what conditions should we expect them to be in? These are the sort of questions you need to ask. This is the kind of evidence that we're looking for. And evidence, once again, just to clarify, isn't something that would make it 100% certain to all audiences, period. It's something that would make something else more likely to be true. We don't jump on the skeptics bandwagon and say, if there's even a 1% chance, like Batman in Dawn of Justice, right?
Yeah.
That this is a bad guy, then we have to treat him like he's an absolute enemy. Or if there's a 1% chance this is true, I want more reasons than that. We don't want to make an error on either side. We don't want to be totally gullible. We don't want to be absurdly skeptical either.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the kind of conclusions we're going to make, what's going to matter here? Well, Bible critics, once again, are going to make their living off of manipulating people. Insisting on this kind of widespread circulation of a book or scroll would only be possible during the time and, of course, influence of the photocopier or the printing press. But then, like we talked about, fail to apply those standards to literally anything else in history because their audiences want the Bible to be undermined. The reality is that if we find even one mention of the authors of the Gospels by Christians within 500 years of the originals, we're doing just about as good as everything else we know over 1,000 years ago. And that's just the plain facts. When it comes to stuff like Homer's Iliad, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, the legacy of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Babylonian conquest, even ancient stuff like the Ebla tablets or the Sumerian civilization, all these things are going to stand or fall on what we actually have and how they're willing to come to objective conclusions, even with a little. But the good news is we have a lot. In fact, more than most civilizations can boast as far as their evidence. So let's get into it. When it comes to applying these rules in action, if we're going to find primary sources, again, do we have the original Gospels themselves? No, we shouldn't expect things written on vellum or papyri to last over 2,000 years. Do we have a complete copy of the Gospels, including title pages with them? Yes, we'll be mentioning it by name in a moment. Do we have pieces of the Gospels dated within the lifetimes of the people who wrote them that include the author's title pages? Yes, we do, for several of them, not all of them, but several. Do we have writings of people who knew the eyewitnesses or the authors personally? Yes, many. And all of this would again count as primary sources then if that was in connection with them. But the challenge is, does this actually pass muster? What do we have? Put up or shut up? When it comes to multiple attestation, we'd have to ask, do we have more than one source, depending on whether or not they wrote the Gospels or not? And the answer, of course, is plenty. We have more than one, but we definitely only need two. Do we have more than one person affirming or mentioning the authorship of the Gospels? Yes, we can note them by name as well, and their credibility, not just because they knew the authors themselves, but also they were persecuted for their beliefs. That proves sincerity for historians. And it's also worth noting that I'm not setting a date for multiple attestation. Primary sources have a deadline, the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. When it comes to multiple attestation, again, we set the cap at 500 because that's how we'd apply to other things, like, again, Greek, Persian, or Assyrian history. When it comes to the lifetimes of the people who affirmed the Gospels, who were in an environment where they were familiar with people who knew, at least to the second or third generation, who the authors were, we'll give you 4, just for the sake of time, but all of them within the second or third century of Christianity. So that's the 1 to 200s.
So that's a better standard already than what secular scholars would attribute to any other piece of ancient literature.
Ain't that just fine and dandy? Hostile sources are another important thing that what we'd have to ask is, do we have enemies of Christianity naming the original authors alongside their alleged writings? Yes, we have one for the sake of the title pages and authorship of the Gospels, but once again, that alongside any one of these would be enough to make it historically certain. And then lastly, explanatory power. We're not going to hand wave and say, oh, look, we have copies of the Bible, but forget the fact that conversations about the title pages. Does the evidence actually answer the question, like who wrote the Gospels? Modern Christians saying it doesn't settle the issue any more than modern critics would deny it, but the material is in the same culture, and that's what we're asking. At times, they stood nothing to gain from deception, verifiable connections between them and the authors, and that on and on it goes would lead us to conclude that we have as much reason to believe they're telling the truth as we possibly can. And if you aren't willing to gamble with a 10 to 15% probability that more information is still needed, then you're not going to function well in life if those are your rules and standards. I understand that people like to pull the Hegel maneuver and say, well, you claim that this is the inspired word of God, and I'm going to eisegete Matthew 5 and say that he made a promise that he didn't actually do. Well, you need to be able to provide that level of evidence because I said so. What we're doing is treating this like anything else in history would, and giving us that many more reasons to recognize if it's putting this information forward, it's that much more significant, not that much more demanding of evidence. I understand not wanting to put your blind faith in a religion, but I do not understand to this day why Christianity and Judaism have to play by different rules, both textually, historically, or even internationally, that no one else has to play by.
And if you think about the Gnostic Gospels, where were all written over 120 years at least after the fact.
And lied about the title pages because the authors were already dead by the time they came
Yeah,
into
they used
existence.
pseudonyms. They attributed the authors to eyewitnesses, but they weren't written by eyewitnesses because they were written way after their death. But if I were to attribute names to the 4 Gospels after the fact, later, after all the eyewitnesses were dead, you would think that I would actually pick 4 eyewitnesses. Luke was not an eyewitness. Mark was not an eyewitness. Why would I use those names?
Matthew wasn't popular. John was the last one.
Yeah, you'd think I would call it, like, as you see with the Gnostic writings, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary. You have these names that are the popular names in the narrative. You would think that if you were going to just, well, someone had to have written this, let's put Peter's name on it because that makes the most sense. Clearly, that would be the most obvious thing to do. So either they were horrible at making up authors, or there is a tradition that they were actually following the evidence as they maintained. Because one of the myths that I think that I hear all the time that you're about to address is, oh, none of the copies of the manuscripts that we have, even the full copies, don't have their names on them. They're anonymous.
That's false, but we'll get into
I
that.
hear it all the time. I mean, it's like a repeated, the emperor has no clothes. So is it true? And you're going to cover that next, I think. Yep.
Yeah, and obviously just driving that point home as well, when the Gnostic Gospels come up, and maybe we can do a segment on the Hammurabi library if you want.
Yeah.
But all of these issues that are being brought up, all of these standards, all of these objections, we'll handle some at the time that will be allowed to us is going to grant. But if someone's going to throw an 8-day fit about the whole issue of that's not good enough for me, that's an individual problem, not an evidential one.
Yeah, Peter Atkins in an interview on That's Incredible, I think the name of the show is, the British podcast radio show, and he was asked if Jesus appeared and said, "I'm God, this is all true," then would you believe? And he goes, "No, I would just attribute it to some sort of mental delusion or something."
Yeah, and
There was no amount of evidence, the criteria was zero. There was no, well, I would believe it if you could prove to me. No, there was no amount of evidence that would ever sway his mind. And I think that's what happens when it comes to these kind of topics, is that you have historical standards, higher criticism that applies to pieces of ancient literature. And then when they hit something that has to do with, hits close to home, my personal accountability to my creator, all of a sudden the criteria for what constitutes evidence and proof begins to go here, 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 to the point where based on that, I couldn't even prove to you that I exist, or that what I had for dinner last night, or that I wrote my own report for my senior year in English, or whatever it might have been.
Yeah, and you see the issue there. I think it was the same interview, but he even put forward a standard. He was asked, what would convince you that the Bible is from God? And he said, well, it'd have to have mathematical and biochemical formulas and so forth. But then he went on to clarify, but even if it did, I wouldn't believe it. I'd say that it was tampered with or something. Mm-hmm. The point being made is, and this is why we want to stay one step ahead of these objections, when you're making the point about a suggestion or an idea, what you're doing is not making an argument from your suggestion. You're proving explanatory power, because why would they give Matthew the attributing to the first gospel and not Peter or Mary? Your argument isn't there's a better option, therefore that is the reason. Your argument is your objection is all about or centered on these were embellished, therefore let's prove it. Well, there's now more things that you have to prove because better options were available. And if you're going to attribute malice, the shoe has to fit. So he's playing with, and this is what I think I'm representing the argument properly, you're playing with an assumption based on a lack of evidence, putting it forward because it emotionally appeals to people, but actually challenging and saying, now you have to have more evidence because there are fewer reasons to believe that than if they were lying to just jump all the way to the first guy in line, Peter, James, and John. So that being said.
And you'll hear things, and we don't have to address this today, but you'll hear things like, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So
yeah, I'd say consistency is always king, but if the one dictating the demands for evidence wouldn't apply to anything else in history, I'd say you're being unreasonable, not regarding these things in higher regard. So if the standards don't apply to anything else in reality, it's unrealistic by definition. If the standards are above anything in reality, it's unrealistic by definition. If the standards line up with reality, then you have to not be more demanding with the evidence, but more scrutinizing with the data. And that's what we want to do with anything. But if someone's going to kind of do an equivocation and saying high standards means impossible, that we have extraordinary, meaning blow your mind stuff. There's blow your mind stuff in the Theogony and the Bhagavad Gita and any other religious text. They'll just happily treat that as an insight in their culture and history, even if they don't even suggest it hasn't happened. You don't have, protests and legislation against the hiring of Norse pagans into Icelandic culture. But suddenly when a Christian gets elected, it's the end of the world. The point being made is there's a agenda here, and we don't want to fall into the opposite direction either. So what evidence do we actually have?
So is there any evidence to suggest one way or the other? Are they anonymous in the sense of what the manuscripts say? So let's start with the manuscripts. Do we have manuscripts with their names on them?
Yeah, plenty. Let's start with the Gospel of Matthew. The manuscripts, of course, start with our earliest complete copy of the Old and New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus.
Yeah, 3rd century.
You can look up digital copies, extremely high quality. And if you have a Greek translator, you would note when you turn to the title pages of each of the 4 Gospels, it reads Evangelion ta Matthaion, Evangelion ta Johannan, so on and so forth. Our earliest complete copy, which is 4th century, so just making sure you understand.
4th century, 350s.
Yes.
Okay.
It is, of course, a later document, but when it comes to us actually having a piece of evidence. We're noting the cap at 500 because that would apply to any other civilization. You have the title pages within circulation at a very obscure place in the Christian world. The Sinai Desert's not exactly a tourist spot. But when we're noting our first complete copy, you can look it up online, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex meaning book, and Sinaiticus referencing the Sinai Desert the monastery was located in. But that includes their title page and name attributed to them the same that we do today. Another, for the sake of the Gospel
And
of
that's
Matthew.
the mid 300s, so a mere 300 years after they were probably authored.
Yeah, and
maybe
that's-
even less.
And as far as ancient history, over 1,000 years ago, that's very, very early as
Right,
far as
yeah.
manuscripts go. But that's not the only one. We have manuscripts, not whole copies, but smaller fragments, like, and this is for the Gospel of Luke as well, P4, P64, and P67, which include a copy of the Gospel of Matthew that includes Evangelion Tomatheion, the Gospel according to Matthew in Greek. That would note us giving more reasons to note these were in circulation.
And what year was that fragment dated?
Those are 3 different fragments. So
The
I
one
can't
with
remember the back of my
Matthew,
head,
that
but
was the
was
Magdalene
210.
manuscript, right?
yeah.
So yeah, that one was, I mean, it's controversially dated, but Karsten Peter Thied dated it to the 60s.
Yeah, and again, I'd be more willing to give it the 100 range, but the idea of us having anything earlier than Sinaiticus shows that we have a gap between Matthew and Matthew in that copy and this one, and it's still consistent. So that suggests a pattern going forward that this was something that was solidified.
Yeah.
The skeptic steps in and says, well, that's when they made it up. You got to prove something contrary. You got to
But
prove
wait a
the
minute,
Gospel of Matthew.
the narrative, if you read the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, says that this was all during the councils in the 5th and 6th centuries.
Not the 3rd. Oops. Anyway, those are the manuscripts we have for the Gospel of Matthew. There are others, but for the sake of time, those are the clearest and most direct ones without getting into history about it.
And real quick, by the way, how they date these is by the handwriting style and maybe the language as well, certain words in that, but primarily is the handwriting style and that's why they give you big ranges, because it's not an exact science. So Sinaiticus could be earlier, could be a little bit later. That's why they always give you a little range, but based on the handwriting style and other writings where you can get a sort of a benchmark, like a starting point based on some archaeological evidence, and say, okay, well, we know that this handwriting style is definitely associated with this archaeological object and this cave and date it to that, and therefore we can say that this style range is here. And they often disagree.
Yeah, and once again, that's just the reality when you're dealing with ancient history, anything over 1,000
Yeah.
years. But when it comes to us working with what we actually have, if any of this existed as far as the Gaelic culture, the Assyrian culture, anything as far as that side of the world is concerned, even the Chinese, we would be celebrating it as some of the most well-preserved and well-attested documents as far as any culture or civilization or identity in history. Yet when it comes to the Bible, it's special rules.
Yeah, nothing like it exists in all of ancient history.
Yeah, but let's not stick to just the copies, because we mentioned 4. That's not a lot. When it comes to several hundred years, the United States hasn't been around for barely more than 2. But what about other things like contemporary writings? Multiple attestations, the big one, right? So if Sinaiticus is the only solid one they'll grant, even though they pretend it doesn't exist, let's ask if other people were treating it that way, that the Bibles they had before Sinaiticus, do we have people before or even during that time that also considered it Matthew, or was it controversial like Holy Kool-Aid says?
And scholars do not discount oral tradition.
No.
So if a historian who is connected to eyewitnesses of a historical event attest to a fact or a narrative, they would, generally speaking, consider that as positive evidence supporting the claim.
And you say oral evidence or oral tradition, that's obviously evidence because it got written down.
Yeah, eventually got written down, but how they know was based on what they were taught and told and what people said to each other, and then they wrote it down as an independent, like you said, multiple attestation. Attestation.
Yeah, fancy words.
Got
but
my merds
that's-
wixed.
That's where again, standards apply for examining the history around it or the internal and external evidence, which we don't have time to get into today. But when it ultimately stems or flows from that one question, that one issue, do I have a reason to trust this as opposed to doubt it based on the actual evidence in front of me? When people, say, for example, reference Polycarp, but we don't have a lot of writings from Polycarp because he was alive during the time of the Apostle John himself, what we do is we say that's still a secondhand source if we have reason to believe Polycarp was a real dude. And then based on that, we would handle his information with a bit of a grain of salt, which is why you don't see me quoting the early church fathers that much in the program, but we'll at least acknowledge the data, and that's the point.
Now, were they students of the original apostles?
Polycarp and Irenaeus and Ignatius all were, and they'll be referenced. But when it comes to church tradition, we have centuries of wiggle room to work with.
And one of the only real challenge is that these students of the disciples, their writings aren't necessarily dated to their lifetimes, because we have the same issue with their writings, that we don't have the originals. We just have copies that date a little bit later. So
nor should we expect to.
Right. So, but is there any real skepticism that what we attribute to Polycarp or Ignatius were not written by them?
Not consistently, and that's the real key. If you always are going to have losers out there like Richard Carrier, who would doubt his own mom existed even though he was born. But the point being made is, if you're going to actually work with the translations, with the traditions, with the quotes, this is evidence that historians take seriously. Not primary evidence. Don't confuse the two. But it is multiple attestation. And if you have at least two sources, that makes historians' eyebrows rise, because you don't have a lot of that anywhere else. So let's, again, ask the question, do we have contemporary writings? Well, like I mentioned, Irenaeus and Origen both make a reference to the Gospels of Matthew being written by Matthew, since that is the question, and they were quoted. We don't have their writings on it specifically, but Eusebius, who lived in the 3rd century, quotes it in his History of the Church, Volume 3, Chapter 24, verses 5 through 6. And in that quotation as well, we have the writings of Irenaeus himself in his book Against Heresies, where, and I quote, "Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect." That was reference to it not just being written, but also written in Aramaic. Jerome and Tertullian also mention Matthew as the author of the first gospel, and you can look up their resources online. The majority of this research, by the way, is the courtesy and work of Inspiring Philosophy, Islam Critiqued, and other people who have done the heavy reading in this department regarding D.L. Moody and D.C. Moo and other scholars that are experienced in criticism. I'd also recommend the works of Daniel Wallace and his work in making this information accessible for us so that we don't have to get a doctorate before every week. But the point being made is this, that is, if we just had a third of what I mentioned, that would be enough to solidify what the manuscripts are pointing out on those title pages. We have people before those manuscripts. We have people before Sinaiticus, the complete copy. And we also have quotations mentioning him by name as it was already a given, meaning that they were either taught it, so it predates them, or they were the ones that were putting forward the tradition, according to the skeptic's perspective. But you can't say this was invented at the council, because those wouldn't be in for another 400 years. So the point being made is that. Now let's ask the question, do their quotes fit the historical context, or are they playing fast and loose with the data? Well, once again, all of these quotes that we are giving, all of the manuscripts that we've cited, are within the first 4 centuries of Christianity, and the earlier documentation that's provided there than the existence of most civilizations, as we are going to repeatedly say. This was circulated among a persecuted minority, which is why we shouldn't expect to have a lot of copies, and it was under the name of an apostle, as we mentioned, that wasn't the most prominent of the eyewitnesses. They were admitting to less credibility rather than trying to build themselves on reputation. So note that point for the Gospel of Matthew. As far as the authorship of Matthew, we have more evidence to support that than the existence of most empires. So that then being said, let's go on to Mark. Once again, like we said, the Codex Sinaiticus includes all 4 gospel accounts with their title pages, and that being our earliest complete copy is worth settling. If we're going to then go to contemporary writings, Eusebius in his church history mentions it. Irenaeus' Against Heresies mentions it. Justin Martyr's dialogue between himself and Trypho mentions the source from an eyewitness as the Apostle Peter, and that Mark was his scribe. And even Papias mentions it as the second of the four Gospels written. So much for the last scholarship over the last 400 years. This is a quote, just so you're all aware, we're not just saying this out of hand. Irenaeus of Lyons said, wherefore also Mark, the interpreter and follower of Peter, does thus commence his gospel narrative, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets. And he goes on to quote Mark chapter 1 as we read it today. Plainly does the commencement of the gospel quote the words of the holy prophets and point out to him at once whom they confessed as God and Lord. By the way, that also debunks the thesis of Bart Ehrman. He said the Gospels had the lowest Christology when the first page calls him the Son of God.
Yeah.
Anyway, also I mentioned Eusebius, and I do not want to fail to deliver on that. This is a quote. As in the following words, this is also what the presbyter said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, so we're noting the eyewitness, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, referencing Luke, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. But afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them, for he was careful of one thing, not to omit the things which he heard, and not to state any of them falsely. This is again from the church history of Eusebius, and he's quoting Eusebius of Caesarea. So these translations are putting forward some pretty heavy claims historically, and not only verifying where Mark got his information, because you're not going to get that verbatim said in the gospel account itself, but why we put the gospels in the order that we do. Not just because the manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus list them accordingly, but because the people who lived hundreds of years before that, a full two in the case of these councils, are treating this gospel account as in this order, written by this person and trusted for this reason. He got it from the primary witnesses. But he doesn't hide behind his pseudonym. He doesn't say, this is the gospel according to Peter. Mark wrote it. So he claims responsibility. And Eusebius doubles down on that in his criticisms of the false teachings going on in his day. Even as they were a persecuted minority, they're dealing with false doctrine. They treated it seriously. And they're building on this idea of, with this as a foundation, why do we trust Peter? Why do we trust Mark? It's because they were there. Mark wasn't there, but he wrote these things down and took it seriously.
So we have evidence in the belief that Mark's gospel was Peter's testimony, his eyewitness account, in the first 150 years. If we have that oral tradition, why wouldn't, if someone were to just attribute names later on, because that's the claim, remember? Gospels are anonymous. Someone just attributed names after the fact, hundreds of years later.
Or in this case, 100.
If this was the case, then clearly these councils or whoever were attributing these anonymous gospels to an author would have picked Peter. They would have said the gospel according to Peter.
Yet for some
There's
reason...
no reason to think that they wouldn't have done that. Why Mark?
Yeah, for some reason, they're consistent with the testimony of Christians throughout history. And if you have 300 years later, 100 years later, and the modern event, if we don't have the modern event, you have 300 years of reason to believe the last 100 is going to be consistent.
Yeah.
If you want to argue, but there's still a chance, great, provide evidence to the contrary. Till then, guess what we got?
And there is no evidence to the contrary. I mean, clearly, if I say, well, Mark wrote this, the burden of proof is on me. But if they claim, no, it's anonymous, well, now
have
the
to
burden
prove
of
that.
proof is on you. Show me one complete manuscript that has no name on the title page.
Or would put a positive claim that we don't know who the author is. And of course, him not being heretics like Marcion, who, by the way, also affirmed this. But that's the point. Again, historical context would be the same, like we talked about. He doesn't claim to be an apostle, a scribe, or associate of him. He denies himself the opportunity to ride reputation for the sake of truth that would prove sincerity. We see the lack of evidence because, once again, they were a persecuted minority and poor, and this is early, very early. Irenaeus and Against Heresies is within the 3rd century. So note that point. The Gospel of Luke, once again, Codex Sinaiticus, will be writing those coattails for the manuscripts going forward. We'll mention more with John. But the contemporary writings are really where we want to drive this home. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and, this is a big one, the hostile testimony of a heretic who was around at the same time as Irenaeus named Marcion, who, believe it or not, is one of, not the first, but one of the earliest people in history who wanted to get a written collection together of the canon to support his false doctrine denying the Trinity. And when he emphasized the authentic Gospels and tried to put those forward, he listed the 4 Gospels as we know it, and even mentions the Gospel of Luke by name. And Irenaeus' criticisms of him, because Marcionism obviously didn't pan out. You ever met a Marcion today? Well, you might on the internet, but the point being made is Irenaeus' criticisms of him and the other 5 books that were written in criticism of him, despite still being an underground movement for all intents and purposes, these criticisms of him serve as not only our best description of his false doctrine, but also their quotations in response to him make a specific note of the Gospel of Luke in the 5 books against Marcion. This is the writings of Tertullian. The same opportunity of the apostolic fathers will afford evidence to the other Gospels also, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the Gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, who interpreter Mark was. Now, we have all 4 right here, right? But then he goes on to say, for even Luke's form of the gospel, men usually subscribe to Paul. So he answers a criticism and says, some people are saying that Paul wrote the gospel according to Luke, because you can't have a non-Jew writing a Bible verse, right? Everyone in the Bible, well, except for chapters in Daniel that were written by Nebuchadnezzar, and the Gospel of Ruth, or the account of Ruth, and Job wasn't Hebrew, and anyway, you can't have a non-Jew writing the books of the Bible, right? And Tertullian throws that out of the window and says, look, the Gospel of Luke, some people claim it's to be Paul. We have the traditions. We know who knew them and why Luke put forward his information, gathering this from Hebrew witnesses by all means, but writing as a Gentile to Gentiles about the Hebrew Messiah. So the point being made is that when they verify this information, and we can go into Clement's Stromata 121, he says just as straightforwardly as he can, to prove this is true, in reference to the doctrine he was claiming, it is written in the Gospel of Luke as follows, and then he quotes from it the same thing that we're reading today. So not subtle in putting forward this kind of testimony. And once again, the context was the same. The first chapter of Luke notes that he's putting together a perfect narrative, like you remember with Irenaeus' quote, citing his sources from the eyewitnesses, which included the mother of Jesus, Mary. But that's important to point out to people if you've held their attention for this long. I'm questioning whether I have with you. But let's finish with John, and then we'll get to some of the objections. John's manuscripts obviously include Codex Sinaiticus, but the big one that John also has in its favor is P75. Now, P75 is a second century document, and it includes the third century. It's in the 200s. I forget that when you get into AD, you have to jump ahead one. P75 includes the first chapter of John and more, and it includes, guess what? Evangelion ta Yohanan. It is the gospel according to John. But that would, of course, be before Sinaiticus, so we have that evidence going for us. Contemporary writings include, like I mentioned before, Tertullian mentioning John and Matthew as the apostles who wrote their own gospels in the 5 books against Marcion. Eusebius is quoted to reference the final gospel as John wrote, who quoted Polycarp, who was a disciple of the apostle John. He knew him personally. And we also use that source to verify the authorship of 1st through 3rd John and Revelation as John the apostle. So if you watch Ali Dawa videos and saying, we don't know who wrote it. Was he John the Presbyter? Was it John the Beloved? No, we actually can get the actual historical data here. So the historical context would be the same as those all before him, but also note as well, he was of the inner circle. He was a prominent apostle, but he saves the best for last, so to speak. And we also have Roman sources that note he would have been alive at this point due to his prison records on Patmos. So that point being said, what's our conclusion here? For Matthew, we have people during and after a time in history where you had nothing to gain politically from being a Christian, physical copies before and after that time that line up with Christians who lived during this time, all crediting him and mentioning an apostle who wasn't particularly well known or popular. For Mark, we have physical copies as well as quotes, all in the same time frame as before and earlier than the majority of information we would know about Persia, Greece, or Gaul. For Luke, we would have physical copies and quotes of people who took for granted that Luke was not only the author of his gospel, but reliable despite not being an eyewitness himself. And for John, we have physical copies and quotes from people who knew him personally, crediting him as the author. Now, we'll brush through these real quick. There's still going to be the skeptic who has alternative explanations for this. They may say that the Gospels were circulated anonymously because you still haven't provided the original copies. The problem with that is obvious. We don't have the original copies of anything over 1,000 years ago, and no one expects us to in order to be taken seriously as a historical document unless, of course, your standards are unreasonable. You may say the Gospels are circulated anonymously because Christianity was mainly formed by hearsay. We still have that quiet period within the first 90 years or so. And this doesn't actually connect us to the eyewitnesses. They're just saying it does. But the problem, once again, is all the evidence is on you to support those claims. Provide proof or stop making assumptions. Our proof is given the actual data. You're just being contrarian. That's not how this works. And finally, they say that scholars say that the Gospels were anonymous, and you want to trust the scholars, right? Well, here's two. D.A. Carson and D.L. Moo stated in an introduction to the New Testament, quote, "We have no evidence that these Gospels were ever circulated without an appropriate designation like Katamathion and the like."
So this idea that, oh, they were anonymous, there is no evidence for that.
None. Not according to
I
the
just
scholars.
assumed there was a big stack of manuscripts that had, blanks on the titles and just had the gospel text. And
We have
that's
lots
true
of
of the
copies
fragments,
that
but
don't have a title, but that's different from having a blank title or someone
Right.
positively saying we don't know who wrote these.
that just means that someone took out page 234 and we lost the rest of it and we just have that page. It does not mean that the title was anonymous. It just means we don't have the title page. But the ones we do are always attributed to the author, and it's consistent. A consistent narrative throughout time, especially the students of the eyewitness, the students of the authors. And that was the point that I was trying to make when I had this conversation, was that the students attest that, no, my teacher wrote that. I know he did.
I knew the guy.
I had it as a text in my class.
Not conclusive, but that is what evidence means.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back to our regular program tomorrow. God bless. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona. question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry